When the radiologist pointed to the jagged shadow buried in my jaw and asked who did this, I felt sick saying it was my husband. For 5 years. I believed his injections were for my pain, but that black cylinder resting against my nerve was no medical device. It was a vault he and his mother had planted inside me, and tonight they planned to crack my skull open to get it back. My name is Audrey. At 32 years old, I lived a life that looked like an architectural rendering of paradise. I was a successful architect, living in a sprawling, modern glass villa perched on the cliffs overlooking the Pacific, a home I had designed with my own hands. The ocean breeze usually carried the scent of salt and jasmine, but lately, the air in my home felt sterile, like the inside of an operating theater. This was fitting, perhaps, because my husband was Dr. Sterling Holt, the most renowned surgeon on the coast and the owner of the prestigious Aura Maxillofacial Institute. He was a man of precision and blinding white smiles, the kind of man who looked at the world and saw only things that needed to be corrected. Our dynamic shifted 5 years ago after my car accident. It was a minor collision, barely enough to total the sedan I was driving, but the airbag deployment had fractured my jawline. Sterling had been frantic, insisting he perform the reconstruction surgery himself. He had done a magnificent job, or so everyone said. My face looked exactly as it had before, perfect and symmetrical. But since that day, Sterling had instituted a terrifyingly strict rule that I was never, under any circumstances, allowed to see another dentist or oral surgeon. He claimed that no one understood the intricate custom lattice work of my bone structure like he did. It sounded like love, but it felt like ownership. Then there was his mother, Lenore. She was a woman of old money and cold manners, always dressed in stiff silks that rustled like dry leaves. Lenore did not look at me with the warmth of a mother-in-law. She looked at me the way a scientist looks at a lab rat that is behaving unexpectedly. She visited our home nearly every evening, bypassing pleasantries to hand me a glass of thick, green liquid. She called it a herbal smoothie, a special blend she prepared herself to ensure my calcium levels remained optimal for the implants Sterling had placed. I hated the bitter metallic taste, but she would stand over me, her gray eyes unblinking, until I swallowed every drop. Recently, a dull, throbbing ache had started in my right jaw, accompanied by a low-frequency buzzing sound in my ear that drove me to the brink of madness. When I complained to Sterling, he dismissed it instantly. He told me it was a stress hallucination, a phantom sensation caused by my heavy workload at the firm. His solution was always the same. Every night, he would lead me to our bedroom, prepare a syringe with a clear fluid, and inject it directly into my gum line. He said it was a specialized pain blocker, but it always made me feel heavy and compliant, drifting into a dreamless fog within minutes. I began to notice other things through the haze. Sterling kept his home office locked at all times, secured with a high-end biometric fingerprint scanner that even I could not bypass. He spent hours in there after I went to sleep. The unease truly settled in my gut 2 days ago when I was coming down the stairs for water. I heard Sterling on his phone in the hallway, his voice devoid of its usual confident charm. He sounded submissive, almost fearful. I heard him say clearly that the host was still stable and told his mother not to worry. I froze in the shadows, wondering who or what the host was. The breaking point of my trust came last night. I was lying on the living room sofa, feeling the effects of the nightly injection starting to pull me under. Lenore and Sterling were in the room, thinking I had already drifted off. I kept my breathing steady, feigning deep sleep. I felt the sofa cushion depress as Lenore sat near my head. I expected her to smooth my hair or perhaps adjust to the throw blanket. Instead, her cold, bony fingers traced the line of my jaw. She did not caress me. She pressed firmly, clinically, right onto the sore spot where the buzzing was loudest. I fought the urge to flinch as she whispered to her son that it was ripening perfectly. At that moment, keeping my eyes shut was the hardest thing I had ever done, because I realized I was not their family. I was their project. The opportunity arrived wrapped in a pristine travel itinerary. Sterling announced he had to fly to Europe for an emergency international medical symposium in Zurich and would be gone for 3 days. He kissed me on the forehead with that same practiced clinical detachment, handed me a fresh vial of painkillers, and told me to be a good girl while he was away. But the moment his black sedan disappeared down the driveway, the pain in my jaw shifted from a dull throb to a blinding, white-hot agony. It felt as if something was trying to claw its way out of my bone. I took the medication he had left, swallowing 2 pills at once, but they did absolutely nothing. It was as if I were swallowing sugar tablets. The realization that my husband might have switched my medication to keep me suffering, or perhaps to keep me compliant, made me feel cold despite the feverish heat radiating from my face. By the second morning, I could not eat, sleep, or think. Desperation outweighed my fear of Sterling's rules. I knew I could not go to any of the high-end clinics in the city where his name was revered like a deity. Instead, I drove 40 miles to a gritty suburb on the edge of town, pulling up to a small, weathered brick building that housed a private dental practice. I wrapped a scarf around my head and paid cash at the front desk, signing in under the name Sarah Jenkins. I was terrified that even a digital footprint in the insurance system would alert Sterling, so I told the receptionist I had no insurance and would pay the full amount up front. The dentist was a man named Dr. Evans. He was the antithesis of Sterling. He was in his late 60s, with stained fingers and a brusque, no-nonsense manner that did not care about aesthetics or status. He did not know who I was, and he certainly did not care about the Aura Maxillofacial Institute. I sat in the chair, trembling, as he examined my mouth. He frowned almost immediately, tapping a metal instrument against my lower right gum. He told me he needed a cone beam CT scan immediately because something did not feel right to the touch. The few minutes I spent standing inside the scanning machine were the longest of my life. The machine whirred around my head, and I squeezed my eyes shut, terrified that Sterling would somehow walk through the door and drag me home. When the images appeared on the monitor, the air in the small examination room changed instantly. Dr. Evans stared at the screen, his face draining of color. He did not speak for a long moment. Then, he turned to his assistant and told her to leave the room. Once she was gone, he walked over and locked the door from the inside. My heart hammered against my ribs. He turned to me and asked with intense urgency who had performed my reconstruction surgery. When I hesitated, he spun the monitor around so I could see it. He pointed to a spot deep within my lower jawbone. I expected to see a titanium screw or a root canal filling. Instead, there was a distinct, solid black cylinder lodged deep in the bone, dangerously close to the 7th cranial nerve. Dr. Evans told me plainly that this was not a medical screw, and it was certainly not a standard implant. He zoomed in on the image, showing jagged edges that looked synthetic and deliberate. He explained that the object was emitting a faint heat signature on the thermal overlay, which was the source of my inflammation and pain. It was active. He looked me in the eye and told me that the object contained microcircuitry. I sat frozen in the dental chair, the numb horror washing over me. My husband had not just fixed my jaw 5 years ago. He had hollowed me out and turned my skull into a storage unit for an electronic device, and I had been sleeping beside him every night while it hummed inside my head. Dr. Evans did not just let me walk out of his office, he practically pushed me out the back door, his hands shaking as he deleted the scan files from his local server. He warned me that the placement of the object was so precise, so intertwined with my nervous system, that only a surgeon with God-complex levels of skill could have achieved it without paralyzing me. He told me that if the person who did this found out I had discovered it, I would be in immediate danger. I drove back to the coast in a trance, the ocean blurring into a gray smear through my windshield. My mind raced back to my father, Marcus Thorne. He had been a brilliant data scientist and a vocal advocate for AI ethics until his mysterious death 10 years ago. I remembered the nights he spent pacing our library, rambling about a master key, a source code he had written that could theoretically override global data networks. I had dismissed it as the paranoia of an overworked genius. But now, the weight of that memory felt like a lead vest. When I pulled into the driveway of our villa, the structure no longer looked like the architectural masterpiece I had designed. It looked like a high-security prison, and I realized with a sick jolt that my husband was not my partner, but my warden. I entered the house, the silence pressing against my ears. I knew I had to get into Sterling's office. I ran to the bathroom and grabbed a compact of translucent setting powder, standing before the keypad of his office door. I blew a fine mist of powder over the keys. I shone the flashlight from my phone at an angle, revealing the 4 digits that were most heavily worn and free of dust. They corresponded to a date I knew too well. I punched in the numbers of the day my father died. The lock beeped a cheerful, affirmative tone and disengaged. The fact that he used my father's death as the code to his sanctuary made bile rise in my throat. Inside, the room smelled of sandalwood and betrayal. I went straight for the wall safe, which I knew he often left on a time delay lock during the day for easy access. Inside, there were no stacks of cash or family heirlooms. Instead, there was a single thick medical file labeled Project Legacy, Vessel 01. My hands trembled so violently I nearly dropped the folder. Inside was a clinical journal in Sterling's handwriting, detailing the cultivation process of the foreign body in my jaw. He wrote about me not as a wife, but as a biological host, noting how he managed the rejection rates and kept the tissue pliable around the metal casing. Beneath the journal lay a yellowed, handwritten letter from Lenore. As I read the elegant, looping script, the final pieces of the nightmare clicked into place. Lenore had not just been a distant socialite. The letter revealed she was my father's former executive assistant, the one he had fired for embezzlement decades ago. She wrote with venomous clarity about reclaiming what Marcus had stolen from her potential. The plan was laid out in ink. Sterling was to court me, the grieving daughter. He was instructed to engineer a minor car accident, a precise impact to shatter the jaw without killing the host, to create a medical necessity for surgery. The implant was not just a device. It was the master key my father had hidden, and they had buried it inside my head to smuggle it past government censors and rival corporations. I sat on the floor of that cold office, the papers scattered around me, and realized that every kiss, every gentle touch, and every moment of our 5-year marriage had been a lie. I was not loved. I was merely the hiding place for a stolen fortune. The sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway hit me like a physical blow. Sterling was back. The conference in Zurich had been canceled, or perhaps it was never real to begin with. I had less than 2 minutes to erase the evidence of my intrusion. I frantically wiped the dusting powder from the keypad with the hem of my shirt, shoved the files back into the safe, and locked the heavy metal door. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird as I sprinted up the stairs to our bedroom. I threw myself under the duvet, shivering not from cold, but from pure adrenaline, just as the front door opened downstairs. When Sterling walked into the bedroom, I was curled into a ball, feigning the misery of a high fever. He did not offer a comforting word. Instead, his eyes narrowed as he took in my flushed skin and the beads of sweat on my forehead. He crossed the room in 2 long strides and gripped my face. It was not a touch of concern. It was violent and possessive. He pried my mouth open with his thumbs, forcing my jaw wide until the joints popped. He peered inside, checking the surgical site with the intensity of a mechanic inspecting a faulty engine. He muttered that the inflammation was worse than he anticipated. 10 minutes later, the doorbell rang. It was Lenore, and she was not alone. She brought a man with her, a short, greasy individual carrying a heavy metallic briefcase who did not look like a doctor. Sterling introduced him as a specialist, but I knew a black market technician when I saw one. They gathered around the bed, and I let my eyelids flutter shut, breathing in the heavy, rhythmic pattern of deep sedation. I lay perfectly still as they discussed me. The conversation that followed chilled me to the marrow. The stranger ran a handheld scanner over my jaw, the device emitting a high-pitched whine that only I seemed to hear. He reported that the battery on the device was critical and leaking thermal energy, which explained the pain. He warned them that if the power failed completely, the data stored on the master key would be corrupted and lost forever. Sterling sighed, a sound of annoyance rather than grief. He proposed an emergency extraction. He said he would prep the basement surgery suite for tomorrow night. The cover story would be simple. I would suffer a severe infection, necessitating immediate intervention. And tragically, I would go into anaphylactic shock on the table, a grieving husband, a tragic accident, and a closed casket. When they finally left the room to discuss the disposal logistics, I reached for my phone under the pillow to text Dr. Evans. My stomach dropped when I saw the screen. No signal, not a single bar. Sterling had activated a signal jammer within the house. I was completely cut off. I crept out of bed, moving like a ghost, and made my way up to the dusty attic where Sterling had stored my father's old belongings, intending to throw them out eventually. I dug through a box of his old lab equipment until my fingers closed around a tiny, round object disguised as a suit button. It was a high-fidelity micro-recorder, a prototype my father had shown me when I was a child. I moved to the attic window and peered down at the grounds. 2 burly men in dark suits were patrolling the perimeter of the garden. They were not private security, they were guards. If I tried to run, they would catch me, and Sterling would just accelerate the timeline. I realized then that I could not escape. I had to let them take me into that basement. I gripped the tiny recorder in my palm, terrified but resolved. I would walk into my own execution, but I would make sure I had the weapon to destroy them before I let them kill me. The morning light filtered through the silk curtains, illuminating the stage for my final performance. I played the role of the broken wife to perfection. I clung to Sterling's arm, my voice cracking as I begged him to make the pain stop, to cut the agony out of me whatever the cost. He exchanged a look with his mother that chilled my blood. It was a look of triumphant satisfaction. They thought the lamb was walking willingly to the slaughter, completely unaware that the wolf was already inside the gate. While they went downstairs to prepare the basement, I retreated to the bathroom for my own preparations. I pulled my thick dark hair into a complex, high bun, weaving the tiny button recorder deep into the center of the coils where it would be invisible to the naked eye but perfectly positioned to capture audio. Then, I opened the hidden seal of my father's old emergency medical kit which I had stashed in the vanity and dry swallowed 2 epinephrine tablets. They were dangerous stimulants, creating a risk of cardiac arrest, but I needed my heart racing and my mind sharp to fight the heavy sedation they were about to pump into my veins. I had to be awake while looking asleep. With shaking hands, I accessed my secret email account on my phone. I attached the photos of Sterling's incriminating journal I had taken the night before. I addressed the email to Mr. Vance, my father's oldest friend and attorney. I set the delivery timer for 2 hours from now. If I was not out of surgery and able to cancel it by then, the evidence of their crimes would be in the hands of the authorities. I hid the phone deep inside the ventilation duct behind the toilet, ensuring they would not find it on me. The door creaked open, and Lenore glided in. She sat on the edge of the bed, feigning maternal concern, but her hands were busy patting down the folds of my nightgown, checking for weapons or hidden devices. I decided to twist the knife. I looked her in the eye and asked if she ever missed my father, if she regretted betraying the man who gave her a career. The mask of the aristocrat slipped instantly. Her face twisted into a snarl of pure malice. She leaned close and hissed that my father was an arrogant fool who hoarded genius instead of monetizing it, and that our family deserved to be stripped of everything, starting with his reputation and ending with his daughter. She had just confessed, and the recorder in my hair caught every venomous syllable. Sterling entered moments later with a syringe filled with a milky fluid. He told me it was just a mild relaxant to help me transition. As the needle pierced my skin, I felt the cold rush of the drug. I waited until he turned his back to dispose of the needle. Then I bit down hard on the side of my tongue. The sharp, metallic taste of copper filled my mouth. The pain was a lifeline, a sharp anchor keeping my consciousness from drifting away into the dark as the drug tried to pull me under. They wheeled me down the service elevator, a part of the house I was forbidden to enter. The doors opened to reveal a sterile, terrifying expanse of white tile and stainless steel. The air smelled of antiseptic and death. It was a fully equipped operating theater hidden beneath our living room. As they transferred me onto the cold operating table, my gaze drifted to the walls. They were covered in blown-up schematics. I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was my father's. These were the blueprints for his ethical AI chip, the very soul of his work. But Sterling had marked them up with red ink, noting price points for black market weapons dealers. He was not just stealing my father's work, he was perverting it into an instrument of war. Lying there, strapped down under the blinding surgical lights, the terror threatened to swallow me whole, but beneath the fear, a cold, hard rage solidified in my chest. I was not just fighting for my life anymore, I was fighting for my father's legacy. The overhead surgical lamps bleached everything white, burning through my closed eyelids with an intensity that made my head swim. My arms and legs were strapped down with heavy leather restraints, pulling my limbs taut against the cold metal of the operating table. I was helpless, displayed like a frog in a high school biology class, waiting for the incision. The only sounds in the suffocating silence of the basement were the rhythmic beeping of the cardiac monitor and the terrifying clatter of stainless steel instruments being arranged on a metal tray. Each clink of a scalpel or a retractor sounded like a death knell. Sterling and the greasy engineer moved around me with practiced efficiency. I could feel the heat of their bodies as they leaned over, adjusting the angle of the lights. Lenore stood near the foot of the table, her patience evaporating. She snapped at her son to cut fast, extract the device, and destroy the vessel immediately. Hearing her refer to my body as a vessel to be incinerated sent a spike of terror through me. But the epinephrine I had taken earlier was doing its job, keeping my heart rate high enough to fight the sedative fog that tried to pull me under. Sterling moved to the head of the table. He swabbed my jaw with iodine, the cold wetness signaling that the time had come. Then, in a moment of supreme arrogance, he leaned down until his breath brushed against my ear. He whispered that he needed me to know something before I died. He told me with a chilling calmness that he had never loved me, not for a single second. He said he had only ever loved the billion-dollar asset resting in my bone structure, and that my death was simply a business transaction he had been waiting 5 years to close. He did not know that the tiny button tucked deep within the dark coils of my hair was recording every single word of his confession, capturing the premeditation of his crime for the world to hear. I felt the pressure of the scalpel blade against the skin of my cheek. I braced myself for the searing pain, but before the steel could break the surface, a deafening sound erupted. The villa's security alarm began to wail, a piercing siren that echoed off the tiled walls of the basement. Red emergency lights began to flash, bathing the room in a chaotic, bloody pulse. Sterling froze, the scalpel hovering millimeters from my face. Lenore screamed, asking who had triggered the perimeter breach. Upstairs, I could hear the heavy thud of battering rams hitting the front door and the amplified voice of law enforcement demanding entry. Dr. Evans had received my timed email. He had seen the evidence of the journal and had wasted no time in calling the FBI to report an active kidnapping and conspiracy to commit murder. Panic should have made them flee, but it drove Sterling into a frenzy. He realized his time was up, instead of dropping the knife. His eyes went wild. He shouted that he was taking the chip now, regardless of the damage. He decided to butcher me right there, willing to sever my carotid artery just to dig the implant out before the police could reach the basement. He raised the scalpel high for a crude, violent plunge. I knew this was my only chance. I summoned every ounce of strength the adrenaline gave me. As Sterling looked momentarily at the shaking door, I threw my weight to the right, jerking my body against the straps. I managed to swing my arm just enough to crash into the instrument tray stand. The metal tray flipped, sending dozens of sharp surgical tools clattering loudly onto the tile floor. The noise was thunderous. The engineer, realizing the operation was compromised, abandoned his equipment and sprinted for the emergency exit, leaving the blast door open. Sterling and Lenore were left alone with me, desperate and cornered, as the sound of heavy boots pounded down the stairs toward us. The blast that took the basement door off its hinges sounded like a grenade going off inside a tin can. Debris and dust clouded the sterile air, and through the haze, a swarm of armored agents poured into the room, their weapons drawn and laser sights cutting through the dust like red vipers. Dr. Evans was right behind them, shouting my name with a desperation that cut through the mechanical orders of the FBI team. Sterling did not surrender. In a final act of cowardice, he yanked me up from the table by my hair, dragging my body against his chest as a shield. I felt the cold, sharp edge of the scalpel press hard against the soft skin of my throat, right over the pulse of my jugular. He screamed at the agents to stay back, or he would slice me open right there. His heart was hammering against my back, an erratic, terrified rhythm that betrayed his bravado. In the corner of my eye, I saw Lenore ignoring the guns pointed at her. She was frantically clawing at the computer banks, trying to rip out the external hard drives that held the stolen data. She looked less like a dignified matriarch and more like a desperate thief. 2 agents tackled her before she could secure the drives, pinning her face against the cold tile floor as she screeched about her intellectual property. Suddenly, the wall of tactical agents parted, and a man in a sharp gray suit stepped forward. It was Vance, my father's attorney and closest confidant. He held his hands up calmly, not like a man facing a hostage situation, but like a lawyer closing a case. He looked Sterling in the eye and told him to put the knife down because it was over. When Sterling spat back that he held the master key in my jaw, Vance shook his head with a pitying look. He announced clearly that Sterling had been played for a fool. The chip embedded in my jaw was not the data vault. It was a decoy, a sophisticated tracking device and security trap my father had designed specifically to catch the person greedy enough to cut me open. The revelation hit Sterling like a physical blow. For a split second, his grip loosened, his mind trying to process that he had spent 5 years guarding a worthless piece of bait. That second was all I needed. I threw my head back with every ounce of strength I possessed, smashing my skull directly into the bridge of his nose. I felt cartilage crunch against the back of my head. Sterling howled in pain, blinding tears filling his eyes as he stumbled backward, dropping the scalpel. Before he could recover, 3 agents were on top of him. They slammed him into the surgical equipment, twisting his arms behind his back until the shoulders popped. Strong hands pulled me away from the table, shielding me from the violence. I collapsed into the arms of a medic, gasping for air as the adrenaline finally began to fade into shock. They led me out of the basement and into the cool night air where an ambulance waited with its lights flashing. I sat on the back bumper, wrapped in a shock blanket, and watched the end of their empire. Sterling was dragged out first, his nose broken and bleeding, his perfect surgeon's hands bound in plastic zip ties. Lenore followed, her expensive dress torn, looking small and withered without her cruelty to prop her up. They shoved them into the back of a squad car, and for the first time, they were the ones who looked trapped. Dr. Evans rushed over to check the cut on my cheek where the scalpel had nicked me. He applied a bandage and assured me that the wound was superficial. He told me I was safe now, but we would need to schedule a proper, safe surgery at a military hospital to remove the tracking device correctly. As a detective approached to take my statement, I reached up and carefully pulled the button recorder from my messy bun. I handed it to him along with the location of the journal I had photographed. I told him that everything he needed to put them away for life was right there in my hand. I woke up in a recovery room at a military hospital, a facility so secure that even the air felt classified. The surgery to remove the device from my jaw had been performed by the chief of maxillofacial trauma, a woman with steady hands and zero interest in celebrity medicine. She told me the extraction was clean, the bone graft was setting, and the foreign object was now evidence in a federal lockbox. For the first time in 5 years, the dull, invasive ache in my face was gone, replaced by the clean, honest soreness of healing. 2 days later, Vance sat by my bedside. He did not bring flowers. He brought a tablet encrypted with military-grade security. He placed it on my lap and told me there was one final piece of the puzzle I needed to see. He pressed play, and my father's face filled the screen. It was a recording made 10 years ago, just weeks before his death. Seeing him alive, his eyes sharp and kind, made my breath hitch in my throat. He spoke directly to the camera, his voice steady. He explained that he had known for a long time that Lenore was circling him like a shark. He knew she had embezzled from his company, but he also knew she was too ambitious to stop at money. She wanted his life's work, the master key. My father explained that he had anticipated his own murder. He knew that if he died, Lenore would eventually target me, believing I held the encryption keys. So, he had set a trap from the grave. The device Sterling had found in my father's old vault, the one he had stolen and surgically implanted into my jaw after my car accident, was never the master key. It was a decoy. My father called it a biorecorder. It was a sophisticated piece of surveillance technology designed to look like a data storage unit. The irony made me laugh through my tears. My father explained that the device was designed to be parasitic. It did not have a long-term battery. It relied on external induction to stay active. Every time Sterling had scanned my face with his expensive diagnostic wands, every time he checked his investment, he was wirelessly charging the very device that was recording his private conversations and tracking his location. Sterling had spent 5 years diligently maintaining the battery of the wiretap that would eventually send him to prison. He thought he was the master of the house, but he had been playing a part in my father's script the entire time. My father leaned into the camera for his final words. He told me the real master key was not on a chip or a drive. It was encoded in my non-coding DNA sequences, a biological encryption that only I could authorize. The treasure was not what was in my head. It was who I was. He told me to be brave and that he loved me. The screen went black, and I broke down. I wept not for the trauma I had endured, but for the overwhelming realization of how much I had been loved. My father had turned his death into a shield to protect me from a future he would not live to see. When the tears dried, a cold, steel resolve settled over me. Vance asked me what I wanted to do with the information. I told him I wanted to burn it all down. I would not settle for a quiet settlement or a plea deal. I wanted a public trial. I wanted every news station in the country to play the recordings of Sterling admitting he never loved me. I wanted to dismantle the Aura Maxillofacial Institute brick by brick and expose the rot beneath its pristine facade. I looked at the hospital identification bracelet on my wrist, which read, Audrey Holt. I ripped it off, the plastic snapping with a sharp crack. I told Vance to draw up the paperwork immediately. I was done being the victim, and I was done being a Holt. My name was Audrey Thorne, and I was ready to take back my life. The trial of the people versus Sterling and Lenore Holt became the most watched legal event in the country. Satellite trucks lined the streets for 3 blocks around the courthouse, and the air was thick with the static of live broadcasts. I refused to enter the courtroom looking like a broken victim. I wore a sharp, tailored suit in deep crimson, standing tall and making eye contact with everyone in the room. I was no longer the patient. I was the prosecutor of my own life. Sterling's defense team was the best money could buy, and they immediately tried to paint him as a tragic figure. His lawyer argued with theatrical passion that Sterling was suffering from severe paranoid schizophrenia and that he believed he was saving the world by using me as a vessel. They claimed he was not responsible for his actions due to a psychotic break. It was a compelling narrative, designed to garner sympathy and a sentence of institutionalization rather than prison. Then it was my turn. My lawyer, Vance, called me to the stand to present the evidence that would shatter their insanity plea. We played the audio recording from the button I had hidden in my hair bun. The courtroom went deathly silent. Sterling's voice filled the room, but it was not the raving of a lunatic. It was the calm, bored tone of a man discussing a business transaction. He spoke clearly about cutting my throat to retrieve the asset before the police arrived. Then the jury heard Lenore, her voice sharp and cruel, urging him to dispose of my body quickly so they could flee. The biorecorder data from the chip in my jaw corroborated everything, showing that his heart rate remained steady and calm while he planned my murder. The reaction in the room was visceral. The jurors looked at the defendants with undisguised horror. The facade of the respectable doctor and the noble mother crumbled instantly, revealing the cold-blooded monsters underneath. There was no insanity here, only greed and malice. The judge, a stern woman who seemed personally offended by the gross violation of medical ethics, did not hesitate. She sentenced both Sterling and Lenore to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She stated that their crimes were a grotesque mockery of human life and trust. Furthermore, she ordered the immediate seizure of all assets. The Aura Maxillofacial Institute, the patent portfolio, the villa on the coast, and every single account were stripped from them and awarded to me as restitution. As the bailiffs moved to cuff them, Lenore finally lost her composure. She began to scream, lunging against the restraints, shouting that I was a thief who had stolen her birthright. Sterling hung his head, defeated. I stopped at the railing and looked Lenore directly in the eyes. I did not say a word. I just gave her a cold, razor-sharp smile, the exact same expression she used to give me when she forced me to drink those poisoned smoothies. Outside on the courthouse steps, with the cameras flashing like a lightning storm, I made my statement. I announced that I would not keep a single cent of the $50 million I had been awarded. Instead, I was using the entire sum to launch the Thorn Foundation. It would be a dual-purpose organization dedicated to providing legal aid for women in abusive, coercive control situations and fighting for ethical transparency in artificial intelligence and medical technology. I took the fortune they killed for and turned it into a shield for everyone else. The grass was damp against my shoes as I stood before the simple granite marker bearing the name of Marcus Thorn. I placed a single white lily on the cold stone and whispered a quiet thank you to the earth beneath my feet. My father had not just left me an inheritance. He had turned his own death into a weapon to ensure my survival. He had played a game of chess against monsters for 10 years from the grave, and he had won. Vance met me at the cemetery gates. He did not hand me a check or a stack of documents this time. Instead, he held out a secure tablet displaying a simple audio waveform interface. He explained that the physical chip in my jaw and the decoy data drives were never the real vault. The true master key, the access to the global network of clean energy patents my father had secretly developed, was biometric. It was locked by a voice encryption sequence that only I could provide. I took the tablet and spoke the phrase my father had taught me as a child, a phrase I thought was just a lullaby. The screen flashed green. The numbers that began to scroll across the display were staggering. It was not just millions. It was billions of dollars in accumulated royalties that had been compounding in offshore trust accounts, waiting for me to be free enough to claim them. The first thing I did with my new power was to purge the past. I put the coastal villa on the market immediately. I could not spend another night in that beautiful glass-walled prison where I had been drugged and monitored like a lab rat. I sold it to a developer who planned to tear it down, which felt like poetic justice. In its place, I bought a penthouse in the city center with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked down on the world, a fortress of solitude where I controlled the locks and the cameras. A week after I moved in, a letter arrived from the state penitentiary. The handwriting was shaky, but I recognized the slant immediately. It was from Sterling. He wrote pages of pathetic, rambling excuses, begging for my forgiveness and claiming he had been manipulated by his mother. He asked me to visit him, to give him one chance to explain his side. I did not burn the letter. Instead, I had it framed in severe black wood and hung it on the wall of my new office. It was not a memento of love, it was a war trophy. It served as a daily reminder that predators exist and that I had the strength to crush them. I kept my promise to the man who helped save me. I met Dr. Evans for lunch at the finest restaurant in the city. He looked uncomfortable in his old suit amidst the luxury, but I smiled and handed him a contract. I appointed him as the chief medical ethics advisor for the Thorn Foundation with a salary that would allow him to retire whenever he wanted. He teared up, shaking my hand across the table, and I knew that for the first time in years, I was building a circle of people I could actually trust. I spent my evenings writing. I poured every detail of my trauma, the gaslighting, and the physical violation into a manuscript. It was painful, but it was necessary. When the book was announced, the pre-orders broke records. I was no longer just an architect or a victim. I was becoming a symbol for women who had been silenced by the men who claimed to protect them. On a bright Tuesday morning, I stood in front of the full-length mirror in my dressing room. I traced the faint silver line of the scar running along my jawbone. It no longer throbbed with pain. The implant was gone, the poison was gone, and the fear was gone. The scar was just a mark of history, a physical proof that I was unbreakable. I walked out onto my balcony, the city skyline gleaming under the sun. My phone chimed in my hand. It was a notification from the bank confirming the final transfer of the inheritance. The balance was a number so large it looked abstract. I looked out at the horizon, took a deep breath of the clean, high-altitude air, and smiled. The game was finally starting for real, and this time, it would be played entirely by my rules. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please comment down below where you are listening from so we can share our thoughts together. And don't forget to subscribe to the Lily Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and hit the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.